All right, we will call the meeting to order here at 8:04 a.m. with the School Committee Finance Subcommittee. We, just so you know, is on camera. We have a member of the public here joining us, observing. Sorry, you can say good morning.
Good morning.
Katie is not here, so we will skip past the assistant superintendent report. Mostly want to jump down to a review of the budget timeline document and the committee coordination conversation that we started in past weeks. Link of that budget calendar was in the materials for this week's meeting. You scroll down to the third page. I can share my screen. Scroll down to the third page. That's where the agenda is. I'm sorry, the table is that I worked to update, as I said I would last week. Can you all see this?
It's loading on my end, at least.
Screen share is loading. Yep. Okay.
Yep, I can see it.
Great. Okay, so took kind of what we discussed last time and the draft from the prior year and tried to update this as it relates to like the sequence of meetings. Just did that kind of yesterday and this morning, so I'm sure none of y'all had a chance to walk through it. So I think what would be helpful is, as we ultimately kind of want to align on the sequence of meetings and checkpoints throughout the process, and then we want to be able to share that with the full school committee to get any feedback from them too, in terms of when we're involving them. So if it makes sense to y'all, we can kind of just walk through kind of item by item and just talk through if the sequence kind of makes sense, if there's something that feels like it's missing within this part. I don't have meeting dates. I just mostly try to kind of put things in order. There's some meeting dates that are just left in from last year's that I thought might be useful as like checkpoints. And then some meeting dates we do have finalized, like the town administrator. But from a process perspective, does that make sense to you, Amanda, Nathan? Can I walk through it?
Yeah, that sounds great, Mark. Thank you.
So I thought the first thing we should try and get from the school department is to a presentation kind of on what draft budget priorities they have for next year. Right, what are the goals they are looking to kind of accomplish, broadly speaking, not necessarily talking maybe position by position or program by program, but just kind of what are the things that are going to drive the work they're doing that is already driving kind of the conversations they're doing internally potentially, so that we can get feedback on if there are any priorities we feel like they are missing, or any priorities we are, I don't know, want to push back on, and then that kind of using that as the foundation for obviously future budget presentations. But to me, that's kind of the first thing I think we should ask the school department for prior to just getting kind of a full draft budget and have them go through that whole process without hearing from us first. I talked about it a little bit, but I think
I think that's a great idea, and I'm wondering if the school committee in the subcommittee wants to hear that in depth from the school department, or does the school committee members have ideas that they want to add as we go along? Do we want to have this be a parallel conversation, or we present something in general to you and then have you comment on it, or do people already have ideas of what they would like to add? Katie and I have had conversations, generally speaking, that, to start, we would like to have a conversation about transportation, identify what needs we have that could be sorted by the budget for increased bus service. So that, to me, generally priority would be making sure that we have at least one more bus, and we coordinate that in a way that makes sense for the community. Whether that needs to be two or not, it would be decided when we go through the practice with the bus company. But so that would be a budget add. We're thinking about wanting to make sure that we have a full administrative team. So if we made the two cabinet positions of assistant superintendent for teaching and learning full-time, and possibly the HR coordinator full-time, that would be something we'd want to discuss. And then generally speaking, without having talked to the principals fully yet, even though we've had some broader conversations, I did give them an update that we as a district would like to follow through on the discussion at this table with coming up with what will need to be added to our revolving accounts each fiscal year in order to create a, 3 to 4 year plan to make sure that all of our revolving accounts have sustainable balances that are appropriate with the budget of our size that provide and execute the way the revolving account should. So the big ones being transportation, athletics, special education out of district, et cetera. Just that will be a parallel conversation about what we can have at this table about the minimums and the policy setting that we'd like to do in order to support that conversation. And that's the biggest framework that I'm kind of thinking through in my brain that needs to be done for a 2 to 4 year plan.
Yeah, you're almost even just, not to interrupt, I guess, but you're almost even getting into like sharing some of those budget priorities, which I think is good. I do think, I mean, from my perspective, and then Nathan push back, I think it would be helpful first to hear what y'all's priorities are, because I do think y'all see the vision more clearly, like being on the ground and what kids need, what this district needs. And so from my perspective, I'd love to hear kind of, what you're kind of starting to share. And then from there, us be able to provide, ask questions on those, provide any pushback, and have that conversation on, what these things are, what might be missing, kind of again, at the finance committee level.
Mhm.
And then eventually, I have down here, right, take that conversation and say like, all right, we all feel like we understand and feel good about those priorities. Let's now take it to the full school committee to have that kind of same conversation presentation at that public space and with the other committee members. Well, Nathan, Amanda, what makes sense to you?
If I could jump, so Mark, when you say that, how does that differ from what is the first bullet point? Do you mean in the sense that this first bullet point would be the priorities have already been winnowed down and you're looking to hear the conversation earlier, or does this align with what you were saying?
By first bullet point, you mean this right here?
Yes, yep.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that is the conversation, and again, we're having some of it now, and it's not to say that it's maybe necessarily a single meeting, like I think we talked about a couple of these things.
Right.
Just making sure that we as a committee, as the finance subcommittee, feel kind of good and align on what the draft budget priorities are for next year, hearing that from the department and giving any feedback to them.
Mhm.
And then, a few meetings later, and obviously we're skipping over a couple things, is taking that same presentation to the full school committee.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah, I think having that lens in sooner is better, kind of understanding the priorities and why. And I also think the areas that John had referenced around transportation, any roles that would be looking to be moved to full-time, the revolving accounts, I think those are all points. Those are big budget areas that I think it would be important for us to have an understanding of and recognize where they are in the priority list. So that's nice to hear those pulled out.
Yeah, I just want to name that we don't have like discussion of budget priorities as part of the agenda itself.
Correct.
And so like I want to be mindful of that from a just agenda.
Yes.
That get too much into the weeds of actually the discussion.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I'll name that with that, I'm somewhat concerned about timeline in that I don't think our next meeting after this week is the 15th. That meeting is already kind of tagged for the town administrator. I don't think the town administrator, I think the town administrator's presentation is going to take up our whole meeting. I don't think we're going to have a lot of other time to discuss. So I'm just naming kind of on our like every 2-week cadence. Some of these things are going to start to feel like we don't have enough time and we won't, it's something we discussed earlier. We'll like naturally need to move to kind of potentially meeting more frequently in order to get these things done. So this somewhat leads into a later agenda item in terms of next meetings and things like that. But and again, maybe we'll have enough time today. I'm not confident we will. just raising that I think we might want to meet next week,
Mhm.
try and get this done. But
Mark, just a quick comment. I agree with you and Amanda that hearing the management team's priorities first makes sense. I guess we're hearing from the town administrator next week, and I don't recall if is that a meeting about revenue projections?
yeah, in 2 weeks, it's about revenue and expense.
Okay,
He's gonna cover both. So he said he will cover what they're expecting to get in, and then, you know, what increases they are seeing kind of from the town side related to health insurance as a big one, kind of the common things that will eat up some of that revenue. And I assume that conversation will be able to share some expected percent increase available to kind of town departments broadly.
so I guess to me, that's an important first conversation because it will inform the degree to which there's flexibility or constraints in next year's budget. And I don't know, John, if that's the first time we're all going to be hearing this, or if you're having any early insights into those revenue projections just from your co-working with Nick. But it feels like we need to get through that first before we can think about what the priorities are. And then as we hear about priorities, what would be helpful for me is to also have a conversation about just like philosophically, you know, I've been thinking about next year as another kind of like hold tight budget year, especially with our reserve funds in the state that they are. But maybe we can just norm around as a group philosophically where we think that what we think that budget year is going to feel like. And then, John, the priorities you named align with what I think are important. And again, we don't have to get into the details, but when we do talk about it, I think another thing that I would appreciate is just how you're thinking about prioritizing those when we have to make a choice on how to spend the marginal dollar. Is that going to reserve funds, or is that going to fund, you know, a build out of the management team, or is that going to fund transportation? I think I know what I think there, but it'll be, I think it'll be helpful to hear your perspective on that as well.
Okay,
Yeah, Nathan, I totally agree with that. I guess the place I'd push back on, I think that conversation is important to have even before understanding revenue and expenses. I think obviously if revenue comes in high and expenses for the town come in low and the percent increase the schools can see is larger, then that opens up the possibility of doing more within our priorities or accomplishing more priorities. But I mean, I think we can say, hey, here are the priorities. I totally agree that we need to have a conversation about how we are ranking those priorities, right? Like, what are the things we absolutely need to do first, and then what are the things we want to do second and third, less from, and have a discussion of, is this something that we think is, you know, important enough to cut in other areas in order to cover? Because I agree with you. I'm not right now anticipating that we're going to get some increase that will really kind of open us up financially to expand services. I think we're going to need to, if we are expanding in one place, we'll likely need to contract in another. But I think having that kind of, I think we can, and I think it's helpful to have some of that conversation even before revenue and expense forecasts. And then, you know, once we have the revenue and expense forecast on 10/15, that is going to, you know, drastically kind of inform, you know, kind of how we're further talking about it. It does make me wonder if we're trying to have this, and then we have the town administrator, if we, you know, again, the next one I had was kind of talk about the draft budget priorities at the full school committee. You know, we
Yeah,
could,
I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking, Mark. If we can squeeze in a meeting next week, then we could do that. I just didn't know if we'd be able to chat again before we heard from the town administrator.
yeah. I guess my hope would be maybe we could squeeze in a meeting next week to try and have this conversation. We could even then, and again, Amanda and John push back on me, at the 10/8 school committee meeting, have a brief presentation share out of kind of these priorities. We'll have just talked about them at finance. but like, share kind of, these are some of the things we are discussing and thinking about to get the full school committee feedback. And then obviously the following week, we'll get kind of information from the town administrator on the actual reality of the financial picture for the town. And then that, will kind of inform further conversations we have internally. Does that, the goal for kind of next week somewhat make sense?
Yeah, I'd be up for that. I just want to confirm on my calendar, but let's assume that would work for me.
So we have a leadership meeting on Tuesday of next week where we can go over the larger philosophy of how we're approaching the budget in some larger priority chunks, not costing out those pieces, but just big picture.
Yeah.
Not cost areas, but what we want to prioritize in terms of how we're looking at FY 27. And I would also say that not only FY 27, but actually the next 3 years.
Yeah.
And that's more so for the revolving accounts and the technical pieces of the priority areas for the financial pieces versus the service delivery pieces. I am not available in the morning on the 8th next Wednesday. And I'm wondering if we could have that finance meeting maybe prior to the school committee meeting if people were available, or at some other time, Monday or Tuesday afternoon. Not sure what folks' availability is. And I apologize. I have a commitment that I cannot do next Wednesday.
No, that's totally fine.
And I do like the idea of having us give you the broad philosophy and the big chunk priority areas that we're going to discuss in detail. So the school committee can weigh in on if that's the right direction or not. And I'm assuming the school committee would reserve the right to kind of, repoint that direction as we get more detailed, ask deeper questions as we get more detailed.
Okay, just to kind of, I think we can, before we leave, we can try and figure out what the meeting, we can find common time next week.
And can I just pause for a minute, just with Amanda on the call as well?
Yes.
Given that this is the beginning of the budget season where we might be meeting more often as a subcommittee. And Amanda and I plan the agendas for each meeting, and we kind of I have the chart, the calendar, actually, which you're all shared on, that we can just keep looking at. But I'm assuming that we should just hold a chunk of time on the agenda every 2 weeks or every school committee meeting for budget through June, through January, just like, let's just make sure that we include that in our understanding of what the night's gonna look like. So we're trying to balance the agenda for the week, that we just assume a half hour. It could be 10 minutes one week, but it could be an hour the next week, depending on what the process, where we are in the process. But I just wanted to say that out loud for planning purposes.
Yep. No, I think that makes sense. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
All right, so we'll talk about those, present those to full school committee, again, have the town administrator. We have a general timeline on here, which is somewhat disconnected from budget priorities, but an initial meeting presentation to the warrant committee, full warrant committee. I think this came out of something we've talked about, but John, you talked to the chair of the warrant committee about this, and he was on board with, again, doing similar to what we did last year, and at some point in this fall, going full warrant committee, giving kind of school budget 101. Katie did provide a draft agenda that I think was, somewhat aligned with what we discussed. So that's also in the folder of materials. Just look at that real quick. If you wanted to cover budget timeline and process, share the budget FAQ and go over some of that information, discuss budgeting best practices, a little bit of the roles and responsibilities in terms of the school budget, and then what are the components of it, and then talk specifically about special education. So that is her proposed agenda. Want to make sure this looks okay with y'all, and then if it does, we can share that with the board committee chair and try and schedule a date. We have a placeholder for 10/31, but essentially just at some point late October, early November, wanted to get in front of them. Yeah, please.
So when we talk about special education funding sources, are we talking trying to explain circuit breaker and other pieces. My only question around that is we're not doing that for other areas, for other kind of, state or federal funding that we get. So I'm just so we understand that. I mean, and I know that it also aligns with that, the reserve fund, the special education reserve fund. Because that could be another source of funding, but I guess I'm just wondering the intention around this one piece, if it's simply circuit breaker, others, and then maybe why.
So thank you for asking the question. The intent was to discuss the major revolving accounts underneath the components of the school budget, gross expense, revenue offset, et cetera. So we can certainly rephrase that as revolving account balances and resources, and not just call out special education funding sources.
Mhm.
Inside that conversation, though, what we want to do, Amanda, is educate the warrant committee on the ins and outs of the revolving accounts, especially the ins and outs of circuit breaker and the revolving accounts that are connected to circuit breaker, so they
Mhm.
fully understand them in advance of the discussions about budget in general, because
Yeah.
it's such a complex revolving account that has a lot of volatility. So we want to kind of give them what we used to call the circuit breaker 101 kind of education. So but embedding it underneath the revolving account discussion, I think might be the better way to frame.
I wonder if and you can all share if this sounds like too in the weeds or too inside baseball, but I feel like when Danielle came and explained at the end of last year the reasons for the volatility, or the, not necessarily volatility, the reasons why the special education budget can change with respect to, students being referred for special education services, what are the contracted services we have? I don't know if it doesn't necessarily have to be that level of detail, but because that is the one area of the budget that it is variable and can change depending on the number of students referred or students who enter the district, et cetera, that I wonder if there's a level of education on that. Like, again, I said, not going into the depth that Danielle went into, but that might be helpful for people because I think that is the portion of the budget that has changed. I don't know how other people feel about that, but I think that question has come up year over year with the warrant committee and with others within the community to understand the why around that piece.
We can certainly work those anticipated questions into the slides. I don't know if I'd bring Danielle. I feel confident that I could speak to those.
Yeah.
But I'd get a sense from Danielle what she presented last time, if people felt that was a good framing of the subject. But and it reminds me that this might be one of maybe one of several meetings that we would want to have. We might want to unpack this more fully in more detail with the 3 liaisons from the warrant committee. This might be the wide brush that we want to give everybody in the warrant committee to hold on to and understand and think about. And if they have questions, they might be able to go through the liaisons, and we could actually sit and really have deeper conversations with them that are harder to have, I think, in those larger groups because of the sensitivity around some of the work related to this. So I'm in my brain, I'm just trying to think of what we'd like to give everybody, and then what would we like to give to the smaller group that we might be able to have, more detailed conversations that aren't always best had in larger groups on the camera.
Yeah, I agree. And it might just even be simply something under the budget FAQ.
Sure.
And because I agree, it can be sensitive, and it also, there's a lot to take in, but maybe there is something within that around why have we seen variability in the special education funding, or why has that been an area? That might just, there might just be an easy way to answer that has to do with, referrals, or these are services that we're required to provide to students, something along those lines. I think that just might be helpful without going into a whole lot of detail.
Agreed. We can be ready for those questions, or we can proactively try to answer as many as we can within the slides.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that sense of like doing, like your point, Amanda, of the information Danielle shared, I thought was very good. And so doing some like very quick, broad overview of that makes sense. And then within the context of kind of the other funding sources, as we're mostly, it seems like Katie's goal here is like discuss the different kind of funding sources that inform the budget, by providing that extra color around special education expenses, briefly makes sense. And yeah, I think even at the meeting, saying, I think a goal coming out of the meeting too should be, if there are things the warrant committee as a whole really wants to know more about, great, they should tell their,
Correct.
their
Yeah.
subcommittee people that that's what they want them to investigate. They're gonna have questions on that, so the subcommittee folks can come and, to your point, learn more, get more in depth with those kind of three people. And bring it back. I think I've been watching the warrant committee's work this year, and I think the way in which they've had experts come back and present on warrant articles and expertise has been, in my opinion, like quite impressive. They've done I think really much better job than I've seen in years past of having those experts come back and present and speak very knowledgeably about different things. So hopefully that rolls over into what those three selected people do for the school budget.
And just to pause, because the questions that usually come up are partly what you suggested, Amanda. How does this happen, right? How does this team meeting process yield these results, or how do referrals get made, and where are those decisions made? And people need to be familiarized with the kind of the student team meeting side of that. How, in what services are we offering in schools, and why can't we offer more? And how do we, plan for that? That's one section. But then just the technical part of this from a financial standpoint, how does federal money impact this? How does state reimbursement impact this? What does this mean for a local town's operation budget, and why stabilization accounts are important? So there's a financial technical side of this, I think, that they need to understand. And then there's just this, how does special education work, and why do these expenses go up and down every year? So I'll kind of walk through anticipated questions in those two spaces, because they need to know both. That they're curious about why do so many kids, and what does that mean? And those are the sensitive questions that really you have to deal with delicately with the audience. But the financial technical pieces of it are also things that they need to learn about. There are ins and outs that they need to be aware of, the different revenue sources, and how they can be brought from year to year, and what can't be brought year to year. How is circuit breaker actually formulated? When do you get it? What does it represent? It's a reimbursement versus a grant versus and I just think that would be helpful for them to understand too. The ins and outs technically of the money is important.
Okay. Just be mindful of time. Keep moving through this. Other things on the agenda that we don't have that we think would be important for that presentation. Great. Well, then the next steps will be, I will share this with the warrant committee chair. I'll CC y'all on it, so I'll just kind of email it over to them, and we'll see if they come back and have any feedback on this agenda and want us to cover other things or clarify something. And then we will work to schedule a time to present. Again, we'll include y'all on that. I don't think the entire finance committee needs to attend, so you don't need to feel pressure to do that, but we'll figure out kind of which of us want to show up and can show up based upon kind of the available dates with the warrant committee. So next steps. Great. Back over. All right, so that is that. We talked about this. Presentation by the school department. So I did this on projected revenue and expense forecast for the school. So I don't know if this makes sense, John, and maybe this is a question we will wait for Katie, but I was essentially thinking like before we have a final. We are gonna get revenue projection, expense, and revenue forecast from the town, right, of like what they're expecting to get to the schools. I don't know if there's also something, can share around. This, to me, maybe is connected to kind of the level of service presentation we had last year, but maybe it's not a full level service budget, just like what are y'all anticipating the costs of kind of rolling things over, like what are the revenue, I don't know, pinch points between kind of projected revenue and expenses to say, hey, a level service budget is gonna cost us 5% to roll over. The town is saying we're getting 30%, so that's automatically creating this $200,000 gap, well, whatever the number is, just to say things randomly. I think after getting the information from the town administrator and kind of for, again, a continued discussion of, I think to Nathan's point, kind of the budget priorities, to say, okay, well now, these are our priorities. Here's now the reality within the school side. What does that mean around, like, as we've discussed those priorities and things like that? Does that resonate with folks? Is that clear? Is this essentially just a draft budget and I'm overthinking this? I mean, what?
I'm not sure that that's sort of what it would feel like, a draft budget, and I guess I'm not sure about that step and how that would differ from a like a preliminary budget presentation. But that could just be.
Well,
is it more of like is it more of a not a heads up, but this is the way that things are looking? Is it more of kind of like a, is that the idea behind it?
Yes, Nathan, I know you were trying to jump in. I think so. I think it's more before we say, like, I think in a draft budget presentation, let's say there's again, based on revenue forecast, it's the $200,000 cut, which again, random number I'm making up. I would think in a draft budget presentation, say, okay, it's $200,000. Here's our draft of what we are proposing to cut in order to, cover that 200,000. And I don't know if, that maybe we just want to hear that ultimately, but I don't know if there's a worthwhile conversation to have first on, again, here is the reality of what it's looking like. Let's go back to our priorities and to make sure we're all clear on what this reality means related to the priorities. What it could mean, what it's looking like it might mean related to this for the school department, then kind of creates a cut list or a programmatic list and comes back to us and we have a whole lot of feedback on it. Mostly, I guess it'd be a question for y'all of like, is that a helpful checkpoint?
Yeah.
Or not, and by making an extra step.
So my thinking is that there's the budget work and there's the priorities and there's the philosophical approach to the budget priorities. And then there's a couple of variables within the budget in the revenue expense conversation, which is essentially negotiations being an expense issue we have to be mindful of. That's a variable. And also from a town school's perspective, insurance. So those are the variables inside. Where I think that this may be helpful to discuss, or at least kind of lay forward, is then there's the school committee and the school department strategy of how we are introducing our budget conversation to the community and to the town. This is what it would cost us to roll over. This is the limits that we're working with, i.e. the revenue, and that Nick is going to propose to say that the town can afford. And this is how the school is approaching that. So if we were to roll everybody over, we would be X. If we were to stay within our limits, we're going to be X minus in order to meet that demand. And I'm not sure whether or not we want to use that as a strategy of framing for the public. Do you know what I mean? The reason why I bring it up is there is a strategy of presenting this to the public that makes sense to familiarize them with the context of the last couple of years, especially the override money, how this works. Having been at the PTO presidents and the MFE the last couple of days, where did all that, where'd that 9.5 million go? I mean, the MFE, some gentleman who's very, very, well-educated said, do you get all that money at once? Where's the 9 million? Is it in a bank account somewhere? Like, you know what I mean? So like, so we might want to think about how we frame this work. And I'm not saying that we have to decide it today, but I think part of the framing is coming up with some sort of, if we rolled everybody over, let's get familiar with those, those terms that we used to use. This is what the increase would be, and that's 7%. And that's not going to cut mustard this year. We have a 10%, or we have a 5% limit, or the revenue suggests that we can only afford X%. So I'm not sure whether we use that step or not, but I think if we do, it's probably going to be part of a strategic layout of the work versus just having the discussion. I think we should think of it strategically.
John, I agree with that. And the way I was thinking about it, just to add on to that, is, so if at the point we're talking about, we have talked about sort of what our financial philosophy / strategy is for next year, we understand what the management team's priorities are and how those are prioritized. And then we'll have revenue and expense forecasts from the town administrator. I think we're not prepared for a draft budget at that stage, but I think what we should move on to is some modeling that applies our prioritization and strategy to the forecast and says, and John, I think this is along the lines of what you were saying, is okay, here's the money we think we're going to have. Here's what we said our priorities are. Here are, and let's say it's 200,000 under, or good news, it's 200,000 over. Here are the different choice points that come up for us along the way. We said transportation is our number one priority. Okay, we didn't get extra money to fund the bus. So in order to fund that bus, here are the 3 possible choices we could make. Or surprise, we have extra money. We said funding the reserve funds was our number one priority. So here's what we're going to do with that. And here's what it allows us. Here's some other choices that it potentially allows us to make. And then we can debate those different pathways and ideally land on a path that then informs a first draft budget. And John, I really appreciate I think it's a good moment to integrate, completely agree with you, to integrate some of our recent history and decisions around the override, and remind ourselves and the public about what we committed to and what's possible.
Right. Yeah, so it's like level service expense projections be revenue projections, and then modeling impact of kind of priority funding priorities.
Yeah, that I'm going to want to hear you say that a couple of times, Nathan, because it really resonates, and I think that it actually really creates a really nice set of logical steps of introducing the work with familiar terms, coming up with the reality of where we are, and that modeling some of these impacts and choices that is the school committee's role to debate in front of the public, so they know that you did bring it up, you did have hard conversations about it, we did end up where we are after debate and discussion, and that's why the budget draft 1 eventually comes out in a way that's shaped by the department and by the school committee, and quite frankly, by anybody who wants to come from the community and give their opinion on it. And in my conversations with families thus far in the year related to transportations and other things, I'm saying out loud, come to a school committee meeting and tell people what you want. That's what the forum is for. So if it's you're upset about the buses, come and talk about that you need to come and do that. And so that I think that'll just make for a more robust conversation in a more comprehensive agreement at the end of the process with people. And I offered this with the PTO presidents to go out to any PTO meeting and begin to do this during this budget season at any point in the season to talk to their constituents in their buildings at their PTO meetings as well.
Amanda, does that framing make sense to you? In terms of the
Yes,
that?
it does. And I like the idea of
setting up the conversation, to your point, sooner with the community and bringing people through the thought process and the prioritizing of the budget. I think it's helpful for people to your point, John, to hear us discuss it and understand the rationale for why things are and aren't on the budget at some point eventually.
So we'll have that conversation within this group, and then it makes sense to then carry that conversation, share that conversation to the whole school committee to have it both more public and get the other school committee members' insights and feedback on kind of what the modeling impacts are. So then kind of we at some point need to start up the school warrant committee, school subcommittee, and our team on maybe some of these same thing, or just like generally, you know, I guess the question here in my mind is, at what point do we really start meeting the warrant committee, subcommittee on our budget? I don't think it's appropriate to start sharing stuff with them before, obviously, we talk about it, but also before we are able to share that with full school committee. But maybe this is actually too early a step because we're still kind of just modeling stuff out, and maybe we want to wait until after kind of we have our first budget documents. That was a question I had and wanted to throw out to y'all.
I think we'll need through December to make sure that we have a document that we all feel has been discussed and vetted at the table. That's a quote draft one. I think January would be working that through. It's October 1, so working that through the next 3 months and having it ready for presentation as a draft one budget in January would be helpful. Is that what you're saying?
It's more just when we when do we involve the warrant committee? I have down here warrant committee, school subcommittee, right? Once we have kind of a draft budget, we meet with them on the draft budget.
Yeah.
Does it do we think it makes sense to start talking to them earlier than that about these kind of modeling things or not? I think the point you've made is they obviously can come to these meetings, they can ask questions along the way. Just about our process, but is there some type of and so if they need something, they obviously can ask for it, and we might have other touch points in here, but the point in time at which we want to involve them and we need their feedback, I think definitely is on the budget side. Once we have a draft budget, is there anything before that we as a group think we need?
So
Go ahead, John.
I would only say that in my conversation with Jay, they are going to dedicate 3 members of the warrant committee to be liaisons. I was speaking to Mark about it prior to the meeting. Who are experienced warrant committee members, and so I would like to think that they would be attending and reporting back a little bit. And also, not to say this in a way and at all, is the warrant committee, talking about the warrant committee's role in this budgeting process in connection with the school committee budget, the school department budget. I'll just hold my comment from, I think it would be really helpful for us to do our initial presentation with the warrant committee, develop relationships with the 3 liaisons, and maybe that can evolve as we begin that relationship with the 3 liaisons. Because if that's going well, you know, in the way that I think that Jay has it planned out, which I think will be great for them to get updates along the way, we may be able to move that formal meeting with them down the calendar a little bit. So that might be a see how we go thing.
Okay. I propose then we kind of strike through this. Again, obviously we'll have touch points before that, but we'll have a presentation with them later on our draft budget. Great. This is another piece of just the new budget coordination committee. When we kind of, how do they fit in here, where they're placed? And so I was struggling with kind of we're obviously meeting on a monthly basis. So I think for the standpoint of our document, it's more at what point in time do we want to make sure we're getting some information in front of them and some feedback from that group? There's times where they might want stuff from us that, we'll have to share. But that was the lens in which I was trying to think about this and so. I would think at some point we want to bring within like, hey, dude, this is our projected level service expenses. And so. At that find language here. To say, hey, yeah, the town administrator is going to project 5% increase. Our level service budget is 5%. And so that aligns great. We're all kind of feeling good about this. Or not. My sense is we want to make sure we do that. Yeah, Amanda.
I recognize that this is a new committee, so trying to understand sort of the roles and responsibilities of the committee, sort of what the purview is of the members. And so would this be, are these presentations similarly from Nick and from us that is more of I don't know how else to put it, an FYI, like this is the budget projection, it's all of the things that you just said. And is it just that there's not necessarily feedback or a role on changing things or addressing priorities or anything? Do you know, am I saying the right thing? So this is
I'm not even
information sharing versus things would change based on that discussion.
Yeah, I'm not even proposing necessarily that we're sharing at that meeting, like, here are our budget priorities. I think it's more just like, this is, again, the piece in my mind that came up last year very clearly is there's a certain amount of revenue that the town is going to get, right? And then there's some stuff that they have little ability to kind of control. I mean, they have some ability to control, but like benefits and kind of shared service costs like that just kind of go into a bucket. And then the rest is like, okay, what percent is going to libraries, schools, police, fire, DPW, and there is within that it's not black and white, right? There's some kind of negotiation of like, it's a 3, it could be 3.5% for the police this year because they need this extra thing for mediation kind of costs, or I don't know, like that's I think the conversation. I mostly see this committee as taking the place of what we had last year within this counter, which is like the conversation with the select board. Obviously never happened last year, of like trying to make the select board aware of these are the budget pressures we are seeing. And so if at a certain point the school committee wants to come back and say, town administrator said we have 3%, but we need 4%, right? Or we need 3.5%. When that has happened the past couple of years on the school budget, where the town administrator said X and we've come back and said, nope, we need Y. And so I think we need to just have a touch point in time in which we are like trying to share that. And so the town administrator will share what they think they are willing to kind of able to give us. And we'll come back and say, great, that aligns, or nope, that's going to be a problem. And can we talk about that? Like we want to raise this with you and put this on the select board's radar, that this is going to be a place where we're going to need to have further conversations to hopefully ultimately align on a coordinated town budget.
Okay.
So we're meeting with that group this Friday, Amanda, and I think that might be helpful for us to kind of hear from let that conversation evolve a little bit, because that conversation a month ago seemed to be very high level, multi-year view of what the town needs to discuss from a financial planning perspective, which I think should be the role of the committee. And then there were some folks in that committee who wanted to get down to the budget to actual nitty gritty, kind of let's see everything line by line, which I don't think would be a good use of the time of that large group of people, because that's happening at the district level, department level across the town. So I think it'll be interesting to find out, maybe that might take shape on Friday. We might get a better sense of what they want to be informed on. And I also want to say on behalf of Katie and I, and even this group, is that our goal in a perfect world, we're creating a body of work and a strategy of presenting that work in front of people, getting comments from people, and having that story go to every committee that we go to. We shouldn't create a new story for every committee. We should be creating our own pathway of how we're going to create this budget, from the philosophy to the drafts to the modeling against the revenue that we believe the town provide us and what that means at a reduction in ad that we have. And then that's what our draft one budget will be. So I know it's not the reality sometimes when we do get pulled to be, you know, I need to answer these 3 questions. But the real, I always like to start with this, let's control our work, let's move our work, and let's get out and talk about what we're doing and why. And hopefully that presentation of that strategy will resonate and answer the questions from the different stakeholders, which are right now warrant committee, budget coordination committee, to whatever extent the select board in the public.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not hearing kind of strong feelings about this. I agree with you. I think it's a new committee trying to feel. I do think that the issue I've seen the last couple of years that I was trying to solve for is that place of kind of for lack of a better phrase, like negotiation between the schools and the town around, you know, additional revenue and where kind of, you know, additional revenue is going to support. Because the past 2 years, we have not started from a place of alignment on
Right.
this is what the town's willing to give us and this is what the schools need. We wanted more and ultimately got more 2 years ago. And then last year we had to push the town on the need for an override, which ultimately they got to, but then again, we still weren't aligned on the number quite and had to negotiate on that. So that's just a constant negotiation, again, for lack of a better phrase, between our role and the select board's role. And our good job is ultimately it's the town administrator's budget that goes to town meeting. So our job is to try and convince the select board as much as we can, and also hear whatever pushback and feedback they have. So again, we can take that out. I do want to be slightly mindful of time, and I think Nathan, if he's still on, has a hard stop at 9. Somebody. So can we, the rest of this we can kind of talk about maybe a little bit next week and keep going through it. Can we talk about the calendar for next week and people's availability? For the 7th, it sounds like that Tuesday, or the 8th after later in the day on the 8th.
Yes, I can do later in the day on the 8th. If we want to do a remote call, I can have it anytime after noon time. Leading up to the school committee, if we want to do an hour before with just this group in this office, and then walk into school committee at 7, we could also do something like that if you wanted.
That works for me. I could meet prior to school committee.
Yeah, same. So we're talking 6 o'clock on Wednesday.
6 to 7 p.m. on Wednesday.
Okay.
Yeah, that would work.
Okay. All right. Yep.
Could I ask just a question on this, and it might be a follow-up? I guess where I'm not clear now is historically prior to last year, there was a budget finance subcommittee for the select board that would align with the school committee. I feel like I'm missing that element, like where that comes in, and has this, because I think that was, to your point, Mark, for that conversation that you were talking about before, like where you would come back and talk about if there are budget pain points, or, you know, similarly with the need for the override, those conversations were happening on parallel paths and we didn't really connect. And I don't know where that's coming in now, because I don't necessarily, and this is where I'm trying to understand as it's being formed, the role of the budget coordination committee. It doesn't seem like those are the conversations that would necessarily happen at that level. So I'm trying to understand how we work with the select board finance subcommittee more directly, because it feels like that budget coordination committee is where you would then share the conversations that those two subcommittees have had, as opposed to that's the only place where the conversation is happening, because that one feels more informative where the other is more, the role is different, I guess.
No, so I disagree in that I think the entire purpose of the Budget Coordination Committee was that we weren't having the conversation with the select board. We need to have a more structured place to do that. That is the place to do it. In addition to that, bringing in the warrant committee to be a part of those conversations, given their role. Mostly that is kind of the FYI, but that again, this is the place in which we are talking about kind of the two goals, and I think John's right in that it was kind of still up for discussion, but the two goals being discussion of the current year budget, right? Where are we sitting kind of within the current year budget? What are the towns seeing? What are the schools seeing? Let's talk about this. That's why I mentioned previously that like the town administrator's presentation to us on 10/15 may be something that he's going to give either before or after that, also at the Budget Coordination Committee. I assume there will be some redundancy. But we'll talk about the current year budget pressures, concerns, and then also kind of that broader kind of 5-year picture. But I think the goal is that that is the space to do it. If we are finding that that is not the space where it is happening, then I agree with the point that we need to talk to the Finance Committee of the Select Board to figure out a place to make that happen, because those conversations have to happen. Nathan.
I agree with you, Mark. I think the sense I'm getting though is this year, we're meeting on Friday, the Budget Coordination Committee. I imagine that's going to be another meeting of trying to figure out our exact purpose and how the mechanics of this committee is gonna actually work. Like talking about what we're talking about here, which leaves us with 2 more 1-hour meetings of that committee before, November and December, and then we're into January where I think we're talking about budget hearings.
Yeah.
So I could imagine this committee serving the purpose you're describing next year. I am not sure that this committee, just given its starting point, is going to be fully capable of doing that this budget year. Maybe I'll be proved wrong. It just seems like that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, so I think we're all on the same page that we need to have coordination with the select board. We're on the same page with that. And so I think we'll talk about this, just talk about this at the Friday meeting with the Budget Coordination Committee. And depending on how that goes, I can also have a side conversation with the finance chair for the select board, Megan, and talk about like if there are other touch points that we can schedule at certain places that are outside of that committee. It's certainly, there's nothing that prevents the select board and school committee, finance committees from meeting separately outside of the budget coordination. So to that point that y'all are raising, we'll see how it goes Friday. We can bring that information. Nathan and I can bring that information back at our next finance committee meeting and talk about it. And certainly this group kind of is concerned about that coordination. I'll talk with Megan and we will figure out other opportunities to connect.
One of the recommendations may be, and I will have been meeting with Nick parallel to all this work as well, but it might be, and sometimes it's helpful to have the head of the school committee, the head of the warrant committee, and the select board chair with Nick and myself just meet. Because if they're asking the same questions at their meetings and we're all trying to figure this out kind of in this kind of independent, let's just get the 3 heads of these committees together in a room on a Thursday morning, have a cup of coffee and talk about how do we want to work this through the varying groups that we have out there. We all want to do this work once, and what's the cadence of meetings that we might want to have, and what are the meeting structures that are already in place that we can use, or do we need any other meeting structure to make it work? So it might be helpful to do that. That I've had previous experience with that, and that's kind of where you can get some work done in a way that can coordinate some of this more directly, would be my one recommendation.
I think that would be helpful.
And who's the head of the select board? Ben Zoll?
Ben Zoll is the.
So it would be Ben,
Amanda,
Jay,
and Jay.
Amanda, and then Nick and I.
I'm always happy to sign Amanda up to do some more things. She doesn't do that.
Yeah, no, I think that would be helpful.
Great. All right. I know it's 9:03, so in the interest of that time, we have our meeting scheduled for next week, 10/8, 6 to 7. From there, we will talk about budget priorities. I think we'll also kind of just maybe finish walking through if Amanda, Nathan, y'all don't mind. Just kind of reading the rest of the timeline, you know, I would like draft budget readings, just like how many times do we discuss it and before bringing back to the school committee and that back and forth process, naming that out. So take a look at it. We can talk about it. Hopefully that process goes a little bit quicker. But the
No, this
goal
is
for next
helpful.
week.
No, this is really helpful, though. I think it's the conversation is needed. So,
So the deliverables for next Wednesday at 6, Katie and I are big picture philosophy. The beginning of this prioritization of how we're gonna go about implementing that philosophy, the potential ins and outs that we want to make sure that, well, not even ins and outs, the priority areas that we want to focus on for the next fiscal year. And then maybe even having a rollover kind of framing of that as well as part of it. I just want to make sure I give her some good feedback that we can get. Does that make sense from what I think Nate kind of started that whole modeling thing? But the beginning of it is our philosophy on how we're going to approach the budget, how we're going to look at the priority areas that we want to, that are initially in front of us that we want to solve, and how we're going to have to model those ins and outs versus what the revenue projection and expense projections start to look like. We'll begin to model those out against the reality of what we have for financials.
Yeah, but no modeling next.
No modeling,
Yeah, we'll
correct,
just
yeah.
talk
Got it,
on
okay.
those.
Sounds good.
And then, so again, 10-8, that's what we're doing. 10-15, town administrator reports. 10-29 is the revolving accounts discussion. That's what Katie said, kind of our last meeting. That might be a good time. Don't have information to talk about revolving accounts kind of policies, what levels we want to have in those. So we can have that. I think we can talk at our meeting next week or the 15th too, as we kind of look through this timeline and start to try and fill in dates.
We have to include the Q1 in that time zone as well.
Yes.
That might be, depending on how long it goes, we might have something ready for people. At least to have you look at it and being closed, but then comment on the 29th. But we normally would present to this body in October, and then the full school committee, the second school committee meeting, which I think is 10/22.
Okay.
So I'll keep that as a side note. Whether we want to add that is.
All right, I'll also just go through this, and based upon kind of us wanting to have a final vote on the school's budgets at the end of January, I will put placeholder dates here to just say, what does that mean in terms of these meeting cadences? How often, when would we need to kind of have these conversations based on current school committee meetings? And yeah, so I'll try and fill that in too, so we have that.
Okay.
That's great. Great. Anything else to discuss? If not, I will take a motion to adjourn.
so moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
We need to do a roll call vote because we are hybrid. All in favor, Amanda?
Yes.
Nathan?
Yes.
Yes, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.